We are live.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम अल्लाहुम्मा सल्ली अला मुहम्मद व मुहम्मद बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहीम तब्बत यदा अबी लहबिन व तब मा अगना अन्हु मालहु व मा कसब सयस्ला नारन ذات लहब व इम्रअतुहु हम्मालतल हतब फी जीदिहा हब्लुम मिन मसद في अमान अल्लाह अल्लाहुम्मा सल्ली अला मुहम्मद व आले मुहम्मद नारे हैदरी या अली في अमान अल्लाह everyone في अमान अल्लाह
MashaAllah. MashaAllah. Thank you so much, Jawad and Hadi, for that beautiful recitation. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Shireen Naqvi. Today's special webinar on Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam is being organized by Message of Peace, Inc., Bayan Iman, and the Islamic Days Celebrating Council, also known as IDCC. It is being broadcast via Ahl Bayt Media throughout the world. Bayam-e Aman, founded in 1980 in New Jersey, which is publication house of Islamic literature. It organizes various educational seminars and other workshops, including youth camps. Bayam-e Aman has published over 40 books on various topics for both children and adults, including Imamat and Khalifat, elements of Islamic studies, the justice of God, Imam Ali, the man of the era, and textbooks of Shia Islam, and many others, alhamdulillah. IDCC, founded in 1978, has been arranged by the implementation of special events including Islam Day, Prophet Mustafa Day, Imam Ali Day, and others in the New York area. With Bayam-e Aman, it has also organized Hussein Day since 1978, one of the oldest running programs where leaders, activists, professors, political representatives, and religious scholars of different faiths and other speakers on the Imam from an interfaith perspective, along with different interfaith workshops and seminars. Today, we come together to discuss the true ambassador of Islam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. As Shia Muslims, we unequivocally know this truth. However, to speak on this subject, I wanted to look at some writings from non-Muslims. Some may say we are biased when it comes to our first Imam. However, this truth is undeniable when we see what others have narrated on his life. I wanted to start with Washington Irving. He was an American short story writer, historian, and diplomat of the 19th century. You may remember his famous short stories such as Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Let me read to you the description of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He writes, quote, "He was the noblest branch of the noble race of Quraysh. He possesses three qualities most prized by Arabs: courage, eloquence, beneficence, and the intrepid spirit had gained him from the prophet of the appellation of the Lion of God. Of his magnanimity, we have given repeated instances, his noble scorn of everything false and mean, and the absence in which he conducts of everything in the absence of selfish and intrigue." Another one of my favorite descriptions was written by Charles Mills. He was a famous British historian of the 18th century. He actually went on to publish a book called A History of Mohammedism in London in 1818. Sir John Malcolm was also supportive of his publication and created a manuscript from it. Charles Mills writes, "The son of Abu Talib was one of the first converts of Islam and Muhammad's favorite appellation. His talents as an orator and an intrepidity as a warrior were grateful to the nation of whose judgment courage was virtue and elegance was wisdom." My last example comes from Gerald D. Gorey. He was a British military officer, historian, and diplomat who served in the First World War. He writes, quote, "He had been wise in council and brave in battle, true to his friends and magnanimous to his foes. He was to be forever the paragon of Muslim nobility and chivalry." I chose these three examples to show you how a writer spoke about his eloquence, how a historian spoke about how he was noble, wise, and an honest leader. And lastly, how a military officer described him as courageous, chivalrous, and warrior. This was our Amir al-Mu'mineen. He was a leader, poetic, eloquent, honest, wise, and chivalrous. He was exemplary example of a human being, not only for Muslims, but everyone around the world. He is the true beacon of Islam. With that, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Sayyid Ridwan Zamir. Dr. Zamir is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Davidson College in North Carolina. He did his PhD at the University of Virginia and his bachelor's at the James Madison University. He has taught introductory and advanced courses in areas of Islamic studies. Over the years, he's been probing of humanities and the being of humans has led him to the path of reimaging the study of Islam within the Western liberal arts institutional settings, and now to the path of engaging competitive religion and interreligion dialogue, especially between Christianity and Islam. He has also taught the humanities programs and now seeks to build the South Asian Studies program at Davidson. Dr. Zamir enjoys developing new courses and has taught over 23 courses. In his religious studies courses, he explores Christian-Muslim relations in history, the history and challenges of the academic study of religion, comparative religious art, and Native American traditions. He is also busy writing an undergraduate textbook on Islamic ethical thought and practice. Without any further ado, I would like to present to you your moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Sayyid Ridwan Zamir.
Thank you, Shireen. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I welcome everyone to this, what used to be seminars, now called webinars, Zoom webinar. I think topic has already been introduced. This is, we have invited 4 esteemed scholars that I have known over the years, but never met them in person, except for one, Agha Suleiman. And the theme, I just wanted to clarify, it's our hope, it's my hope, the subtitle of the webinar, which was, I think, titled Unraveling the Hidden Dimension of Imam Ali, that as we know, there are 1400 years of reflections on this great personality, world personality, not just Islamic personality. It's our hope, and my hope in particular, that through the insights and wisdom and knowledge of our scholars, today we will learn about some of the less appreciated, less discussed aspects of Imam Ali's life and teachings. And let me just clarify. So it's basically 4 scholars talking about Imam Ali. I have the easiest task of introducing them, moderating some question. And I think you will be posting, this needs to be clarified. I think you'll be either post your question or moderator, not the moderator, I think the web team receives questions and they'll be forwarded to me, but that's on the back end. Let me introduce the structure of the webinar today. So basically it will go, we'll have 15 minutes per scholar, beginning with Professor Takim. Each scholar will speak for 15 minutes, their comments. I will introduce them, a more elaborate introduction, short still, but individual introductions will come as I introduce the speaker. So they'll speak for 15 minutes, after which then I'll quickly ask if our speakers have questions for one another. If not, then we'll just turn to the broader conversation, Q&A coming from different places, I guess. This has been streamed on Zoom, through Zoom, on YouTube as well. So I don't know how these things work, but I'll receive questions. They'll be given to the speakers to see their answers are, and then we'll close with any final comments our speakers have, or I'll just say thank you, and that will be the end of it. So that's the structure. And without wasting any more time, I want to turn to Professor Dr. Liaquat Takim. Dr. Takim is the Sharjah Chair in Global Islam at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada. A native of Zanzibar, Tanzania, he has spoken at more than 80 academic conferences and authored 100 scholarly works I'm sure it's over 100, on diverse topics like Reformation in the Islamic world, treatment of women in Islamic law, Islam in America, the indigenization of the Muslim community in America, dialogue in post 9/11 America, war and peace in the Islamic tradition, and so on. He teaches a wide range of courses on Islam and comparative religion. He has taught at various universities in Canada and in the US. His first book, The Ears of the Prophet, which I had the pleasure of reading in my graduate school when it first came out, and his second book, which is Shiism in America, I've used as a textbook for my Shiism class that I teach at Davidson, twice actually. And apparently, and Professor Takim can correct me, there are two topics were given in the introduction that I received, that the one book is on Quranic exegesis that you're working on. The other one says it's Ijtihad and Reformation in Islam. So there's a third book, or maybe there's a third and fourth book that's in the making. So we'll begin with you, please. 15 minutes. Do I need to keep track of time and give like 5 minutes notice or anything like that, 2 minutes notice, or?
Not with me, I'll be okay.
All right.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين رحمة للعالمين بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ومن الناس من يشري نفسه ابتغاء مرضات الله صدق الله العلي العظيم. Assalamu alaikum jameen wa rahmatullah. It's a great pleasure and honor to be sharing a few words about Imam Ali, a very important figure. Just to clarify, the book on Ijtihad and Reformation is already done. It's going to be published, inshallah, by Oxford University Press early next year. And now I'm working on the fifth book, which is on Quranic exegesis. But with your du'as, please. I want to talk about the spirituality of Imam Ali. We have often known Amir al-Mu'mineen through different dimensions. And indeed, he was such a great charismatic figure that even one dimension we cannot even fulfill and talk enough about that one dimension. But the one that I want to focus on in the next 15 minutes or so is about the spirituality of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Islam asks us to evaluate our not only moral, but more importantly, spiritual lives. We often take care of our material needs, our moral needs, but we hardly ever talk about spirituality, especially in the context of Imam Ali. The search for spirituality also means that we search for people who connect us with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through whom we feel the presence of the divine. Wilayat is not only to follow a particular imam, but I would go further and say that wilayat means to cultivate the personality of the imams within us. In other words, it's not only to say, oh, the imam prayed this way and said we should do this way. That's part of wilayat, that's part of the sunnah, if you like. But I will go even further and say part of the sunnah is also to cultivate as much as possible the personality of the wali within us. To put it differently, to relive the spiritual experiences of the imams. Because sunnah, my sisters and brothers, the sunnah of the imams and the prophet is not only what they did and how they ate and how they dressed, but it's also how they connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore we find that Imam Ali alayhi salam was a key figure in Islamic spirituality. In fact, he was a link to the prophet. He was also a link to Allah. Abu Dharr, the great companion of both the Prophet and Imam Ali, would often weep when he met Imam Ali. And when the Imam asked him, why do you weep? He said, because I see the Prophet in you. And I'm paraphrasing the hadith now, that whenever I see you, I remember the Prophet. Imam Ali did not just worship Allah. He went beyond that. He adored him. And this is something that we need to learn from Imam Ali. The idea that we should not just be praying to Allah, not only linking to Allah, but more importantly, bonding with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We find that Imam Ali called Allah from the very depth of his heart. وَأَشْتَاقَ إِلَىٰ قُرْبِكَ fil mushtaqeen, that I yearn for you. You can see the word that he uses is ishtiyaq or shawq, yearn or passion, if you like. And I passionately want to be with you of those who are passionate about you. وَأَدْنُوا مِنْكَ دُنُوَّ الْمُخْلِصِينَ. And I want to get close to you. I want to be close to you, the closeness of those who are sincere. Indeed, an element, a very important element in the spirituality of Amir al-Mu'mineen was his sincerity. Sincerity means what was inside him was what was outside him. This is what we mean by taqwa, by the way. It's not only God-fearing or God-consciousness. It means to be in a state of balance. The balance that we are talking of is that what was inside Amir al-Mu'mineen was exactly what is outside. And therefore the great poet Rumi says, As Ali amukh ikhlas amal, sher hakra munazza as dagal. From Ali, learn how to be sincere in your action. Because the Lion of God, and Imam Ali was called the Lion of God, is free from deception. He transitioned from knowing God to having a vision of Allah. And therefore, you'll recall that very famous hadith that when he was speaking in the mosque of Kufa, somebody stood up in the middle of his speech, Ara'ayta rabbak? Have you seen your Lord? What does Imam Ali reply? Ma kuntu a'budu rabban lam ara. I would never worship a Lord whom I have not seen. But of course, you don't see him with your eyes, you see him with your heart. And therefore, Ali is he embodies that very famous hadith from the Prophet, in which the Prophet ﷺ says, Ittaqu firasat al-mu'min, فَإِنَّهُ يَنْظُرُ بِنُورِ اللَّهِ. Be aware of how a mu'min sees, because a mu'min sees with the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Something that comes across continuously when you read through the Nahj al-Balagha, and I don't have the time to go through the Nahj al-Balagha, is this sense of taqwa. And taqwa is not only, as I said, God consciousness. There is that amount also, but also a conscious which is alive, a conscious which actually talks to us continuously. And as Allah reminds us, ittaqullaha wa yu'allimukum Allah, wattaqullaha wa yu'allimukum Allah. Have the taqwa of Allah, and Allah will teach you. And that taqwa means to be aware of His existence, of something, a conscious which is alive and which talks to us, especially when we are about to do something wrong. Ibadat for Imam Ali was not just worshipping him, but giving yourself totally to the divine. قُلْ إِنَّ الصَّلَاةِ وَنُسُقِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Say my prayers and my sacrifice, and my living and my dying are for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a very famous verse in the Quran itself. Amir al-Mu'mineen was a person who was not just spiritual, but he was given the powers of speech. When you are close to Allah, you get powers that you don't even know where they came from. He had the extraordinary powers. Ibn Abil Hadid, who is a commentator, a Sunni, Mu'tazili commentator of the Nahj al-Balagha, says that about the speech of Ali ibn Abi Talib, Duna kalam al-Khaliq, fawqa kalam al-Makhluq. He's less than the power or the speech of Allah, because nobody can match Allah. But he is fawqa kalam al-Makhluq. He's above the speech of others, apart from, of course, the Prophet himself. So as I said, this was some of the major elements in his spirituality. And many a time, his spirituality rubbed off on those around him. One day, Muawiyah, called Virar was a famous and loving companion of Imam Ali. And he asked him, "O Virar, tell me about Ali ibn Abi Talib. What do you remember about him?" And Virar says, "Muawiyah, I'll tell you just one anecdote, that one day in the middle of the night, I ventured to the mosque of Kufa, total darkness, the mosque of Kufa. And deep in one corner, I could hear somebody cry out. And as I got closer, I saw that somebody was in sajda. Who was this person? Amir al-Mu'mineen, crying out to his Lord, "Oh, for the fire of hell, save me from the fire of hell." This was Imam Ali, that the Imam who we know will go to Jannah because of all his acts, and yet he's showing us what it means to be a true Abid. True Abid is one who just doesn't want the Jannah, he wants Allah himself. He's not just scared of the fire of hell, he's scared to be separated from Allah. حبلي صبرت على عذابك فكيف أصبر على فراقك. Oh my Lord, supposing I can bear to be separated from you, how can I bear supposing I can bear your fire, the punishment of fire, supposing I can bear the punishment of the fire, how can I bear to be separated from you? Because separation from Allah is far worse than the fires of Allah. These are just some of the issues I think that we need to remember. How Imam Ali impacted those around him. Because when you pray, when you worship with your heart and with your complete devotion, then not only do you pray, that you make others pray with you. I want to end now with just one or two anecdotes. One of these is actually cited in Bukhari. 3 times Bukhari cites this hadith that somebody called Abdullah bin Mutarraf says he went to the mosque in Basra and Imam Ali was about to lead the prayer and somebody else joined him, Imran bin Hussein. Imran, Abdullah, and Imam Ali praying. Imam Ali is leading the prayer. And without going to great depth of this tradition, Abdullah says that as Ali ibn Abi Talib went into ruku, he lifted up his hand and said, Allahu Akbar. As he got up from the ruku, he did the takbir the same way. And after Ali finished the prayer, Abdullah says, Imran, the other person who was praying with me, he came and shook my hands. And he pointed to Ali. And he said, لَقَدْ صَلَّى صَلَاةَ مُحَمَّدٍ وَلَقَدْ ذَكَّرَنِي صَلَاةَ مُحَمَّدٍ. He prayed the prayers of Muhammad. He reminded me of how Muhammad himself used to pray. This was the spirituality from Imam Ali. He epitomized Tawheed. What is Tawheed? Oneness of God is far more than that. Tawheed means to destroy yourself for the sake of Allah, to give everything, including your own self, for the sake of pleasing Allah. And therefore, the verse that I recited, I will end with this. At the beginning of this lecture, the commentators are all united in saying that this verse was in favor of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And when was it recited? When did it come down? On the night when the Prophet did the Hijrah. Imam Ali was sleeping in the bed of the Prophet. At that night, Ibn Abbas says, from a Sunni source, I can assure you, Abdullah ibn Abbas says that on that night, Jibreel came and stood at the head of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Mikael at the feet of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And Jibreel, you know what he said to Ali ibn Abi Talib? He said, Bakhin, Bakhin ibn Abi Talib, Allahu yubahiu al-malakata al-yawm. That congratulations be upon you, O the son of Abu Talib. Even Allah is proud of you in front of the malaika today because of what you have done. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. This was Ali ibn Abi Talib selling his own soul for the sake of pleasing Allah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, Dr. Zakim. Now we turn to Dr. Amina Inlows. Dr. Amina, American scholar, researcher, educator, public speaker, translator, and is she Muslim. She works for the Research and Publications Department of the College based in the UK and is also the program leader for their MA Islamic Studies program. She received her doctorate in Islamic Studies from the University of Exeter. Her PhD dissertation was Pre-Islamic Female in the Quran, Shia Hadith Reports. Born in Irvine, California, Dr. Inlows is now settled in the UK. Her many publications include The Queen of Sheba in Shia Hadith, Conversion to Twelver Shiism among American and Canadian Women, Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, Character versus Controversy, Review of the Shia Revival, and The Tragedy of Karbala. She's also translated works of Mullah Muslim Faiz Kashani, I think 2002.
Sorry, can I just interrupt?
And I think there is a lot of
Yeah, there's some
noise.
background noise. Yeah, ask somebody to mute.
I think, Dr. Amina, this is coming from your side, I think.
Yeah, because we have only two on here.
Everybody else is muted.
Assalamu alaikum. I guess there's some ahkam about silent salams.
I think there is wind now, but no, before it seemed like there was traffic noise, but now there's wind. That's just,
Yeah. Shall I go back to where I was before?
no, this is better, I think.
Okay, alhamdulillah, wind is the creation of Allah and traffic is the creation of the human. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for your patience, even though it was only 3 minutes. Sometimes in the modern era, that can seem like 3 years. I wanted to first reflect on a few thoughts from Dr. Takim, which I was thinking about when he was speaking. And that is, to tell the truth, honestly, I do find it very difficult to speak about Imam Ali, peace be upon him. And I was thinking about why. I don't have the same problem talking about any other historical or religious figures. And I realized that it's because if you accept that he is the insan al-kamil, the perfect human being, who is perfected by closeness to Allah and manifesting correctly the attributes and will and intent of Allah, it's very difficult to actually discuss him because there are so many facets to the gem. And we try to arrive at that sometimes through some stories like the Battle of Badr or the Battle of Uhud, which are very good and are very examples, but somehow still don't quite reach the mark in everything. Of course, inshallah, we will be reaching the mark. But I think for me, at least, that's why sometimes this is a challenge. However, I'm not being asked to hit the mark entirely today. I'm only going to be discussing Imam Ali and the Book of Allah, the Quran. So this is inshallah what we will be doing. So indeed, let us bring our minds to the Battle of Siffin, one of the regrettable incidents in the history of Islam, Muslims fighting against each other, civil war. And imagine what it must have been like then for everyone, those on the side of Imam Ali, who is the rightful caliph of the Muslims, and those fighting against him. They were camped there for a long time. It was hot, it was summertime. They're dealing with just exhaustion, the labors, the pain of civil war and brethren fighting against each other. When all of a sudden, something very unexpected happens. Okay, you all know what happens. But nonetheless, this was very unexpected for them. That the enemies come to the side of Imam Ali and they're holding up their spears. And what is on top of the spear? The Book of Allah, the Quran, is placed atop their spears. And this was deeply perplexing. Some of the followers of Imam Ali and the soldiers, who already were very exhausted and tired and worn out from the situation, looked at that and thought, people are somehow right, or maybe we should listen to them, or maybe we should just stop all of this. What does Imam Ali tell them? He tells them, this book that is sitting there on top of their spears, it is the silent book of Allah. It is the silent Quran. It doesn't speak, it just sits there. And I, Ali ibn Abi Talib, I am the speaking Quran. And kitab Allah al-Natiq. Not only does he say he is the speaking Quran, he says this, I am the one who interprets the Quran. I am the one who is interpreting and explaining this silent Quran for you. So do not follow their silent Quran over me. So what does this mean when we say Imam Ali is the speaking Quran? What did it mean for him? What does it mean for us? It should be apparent that if Imam Ali, like the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if he has such a close connection to Allah, one can say a very close existential connection to Allah, that he would be the embodiment, like the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family, he would be the embodiment of the divine word, just as the book of Allah is the utterance of Allah in a verbal form or a written form. Similarly, the Prophet Muhammad and people similar to him, such as Imam Ali, are the embodiment of the divine word, if you will, through their acts, through their deeds, through their stances, through their words, and through their being, because all of these things have such a close relationship to Allah. And in fact, it is related in hadith, and even in the Sunni books, that when someone is so close to Allah that they become like the hand of Allah and the eye of Allah, and they speak, they become synergized with Allah. Of course, sometimes people get a bit deluded about that, and they think they're so close to Allah that they have a mental problem or something, and then they think they're Jesus or Imam Mahdi or whatever. That's a different case. But for someone who genuinely has this closeness to Allah, there is a sort of unity in what they are doing. So therefore, it does make sense that on a spiritual level, Imam Ali would, like the Prophet, would be embodying the book of Allah and explaining it for us, whether or not he's physically quoting its verses all the time. That being said, we also do know that Imam Ali very practically had a strong commitment to and relationship with the book of Allah as a text or as a book. We know that Imam Ali, for example, was very close to the Prophet in his own life, not only emotionally and spiritually, but also he physically spent a lot of time with him. You may recall he mentioned that he used to follow around the Prophet like a baby camel follows its mommy camel, so always in his shadow, so to speak. And he didn't speak in the presence of the Prophet. He didn't give sermons. He didn't give teachings apart from relating what the Prophet said. So he was, in a sense, in this position until he eventually took on leadership in his own right. But not only that, he relates in Al-Kafi that he used to go and visit the Prophet twice a day. So not just once a day, twice a day, morning and evening. And he would sit alone with the Prophet, or sometimes his own immediate family would be with him. And they would discuss the religion, and in particular the revelation. And he relates that with his own hand, he would write down the revelation. And not only the revelation, but the tafsir and the explanation of the revelation and the details of the revelation. Because, as we see in this, anecdote from the Battle of Siffin, sometimes it's not sufficient to have divine scripture, because people can twist scripture. You find it in many cases these days, or in the past. People take some verses from a scriptural source or quotations from a famous person, they take it out of context and they twist it. It's something people can do. However, if you have the intent and the interpretation of it, then it's much more difficult to do that. And so he says that he would write this down, and he is the one who had the explanation of the meanings of this verse. Is it a general verse for all situations? Is it for a specific situation? Is there any abrogation going on in the verse? Is it one of the clear verses or the unclear verses that are mentioned in the Holy Quran, and so forth? So all of this he himself took down with his own hand. And the Prophet also used to continually pray for him to continue to memorize and understand, to the point where he asks the Prophet, are you worried that I'm going to forget some of this? And the Prophet tells him, no, I do not fear that you're going to forget, but that this was part of how he passed it on. Until, as we know, after the Holy Prophet passed on, Imam Ali swore that he would compile the Quran with his own hand. He swore he would not don his outer garments until he had produced a physical book. The question of the compilation of the Quran does come up sometimes. However, according to this narration or set of narrations, Imam Ali was the first to actually physically write down the Quran. Keeping in mind, this was difficult back then. A lot of us would find it exhausting to write the Holy Quran by hand. It was not an uncommon thing to do in the past. I've only met one person in my lifetime who physically copied the Holy Quran by his own hand, and he also made the paper that he put it on. But in general, not only is it difficult to hand copy the whole book, maybe some of you all have too. Not saying you haven't, but they didn't have all the things we have today, like the paper and the pens and the ballpoint paper and bound books. They were using a lot of different materials for this. But nonetheless, it is related that not only he compiled the Quran in chronological order, but also he did include the commentary, and this took about 6 months. However, the people there were not ready to accept it, so we don't have it with us today. But this is what is related to us. So he did have this very deep commitment to the Book of Allah, which parallels his deep, one can say, spiritual relationship with the Book of Allah, which remind us that both are important, the formal learning and the intellect and the studying, but also the spiritual insight, again, as Dr. Hakim was saying. The two work together. If you're just working on one side or the other, it's very easy to fall over, like an unbalanced scale. However, there's another dimension to Imam Ali and the Holy Quran, and that is there are actually many similarities between Imam Ali and the Holy Quran itself, through how the Holy Quran self-describes and how Imam Ali is described or self-describes. It's actually quite interesting if you consider it. The Holy Quran does self-describe its nature and its purpose. Most books do not do that. I open up, I don't want to be disrespectful in comparing other books to the Quran, but open up the Lord of the Rings. It doesn't self-describe, this is the purpose of this book. You can glean a purpose from it, but it doesn't tell you it. Some books will tell you their purpose up front. Some of them will not. But the Quran is one of the books that does actually explain its purpose. So what are the purposes of the Quran? Among the purposes it mentions are to provide wisdom, to teach people wisdom, to teach people the things they didn't know, to guide people to truth out of error, to be a light, to be guidance, to lead people to paradise, to Jannah. Yeah, these are among the purposes of the Quran. Now, how does Imam Ali describe himself, and how is Imam Ali described? If the Quran is truth, Ali is with the truth, right? This is what the Prophet said, or related that he said. Ali is with the truth, and the truth is with Ali. And wherever the truth turns, or wherever it turns, he also turns. It's very interesting phrasing. It's not saying that Imam Ali is simply following the truth, but the two are somehow inseparable. So they turn together, which of course makes sense if we acknowledge that Allah is the ultimate truth and the source of truth. And again, Imam Ali has this such close connection to Allah that he would naturally be with the truth. For that matter, the Prophet said Ali is with the Quran and the Quran is with Ali, and the two will not separate until they reach the fountain of paradise. The Quran also brings us wisdom. We all know this. What did the Prophet say? I am the city of knowledge, and Ali is its gate, and whoever wants knowledge should enter through its gate. Or he also said, I am the house of wisdom, and Ali is its door. So again, we see this close similarity between Imam Ali and the Holy Quran. It would be kind of fun if we had like a Nari Haidari, but I guess we can't do that online in this situation. You can do it silently, inshallah. The Quran also self-describes as light. Now, what does light do for us? It shows us the way. If someone is confused, back in the day when they didn't have street lamps and so forth, and they're lost, it shows you where to go. It keeps you from getting hurt. It's pretty. It draws you to it. It has a certain beauty. There's a certain energy to light. There's many aspects to light. Imam Ali himself has said that my example among you is like a lamp in the darkness, and whoever comes near me is enlightened by it. SubhanAllah, mashallah. And inshallah, that's true whether we're in the physical presence of him or the spiritual presence of him. The Quran is described, let me phrase that. The Quran is often described as containing all things. It might be a more correct statement to say the book of Allah in its maybe higher spiritual form is the container of all things, or the whole Surah Yasin mentions that there's an imam, which there is actually a dual tafsir of this, containing all things. One can understand it as a sort of divine book or divine registry. There are some narrations that point it all to Imam Ali. But nonetheless, the Quran is comprehensive, and many people do hold you can find answers on some level for all things in it. Imam Ali also expressed and taught so many things. That's why we have all of these facets to the gem, whether it's the military, the politics, the spirituality, the sciences, grammar, language, etc. And this is a bit heavy. One of the descriptions of the Quran is it's something that differentiates between things, so between truth and falsehood, between paradise and hell, Jannah and Nar. What is it that is related from Imam Ali? I am Allah's differentiator between hell and heaven. But you even do find this idea both in the Shia and the Sunni books. Different story. I am Allah's differentiator between hell and heaven, and none will enter it but as differentiated by me, and I am the greatest distinguisher. That's pretty heavy, but also another similarity between Imam Ali and the Quran. So that is a pointer to Imam Ali. But what about us? How do we access that? We do not sit here in front of the speaking Quran. There is, of course, a tremendous legacy of sayings and teachings from Imam Ali, peace be upon him, in the books that we have inherited. Of course, there is a certain caution. Maybe not everything that's inherited is 100% accurate, but nonetheless, there's a solid legacy, and I'm sure much of it is accurate. And we can and should study that because, again, knowledge and understanding, at least according to my understanding of the Quran and Hadith, does come through two ways: the study and the insight, or the material and the spiritual. However, there is another dimension, which I think Professor Kakim was again alluding to. And this is something Ayatollah Mutahari said once, and he left in writing. But it's a point that I have never forgotten, and that is there are two ways basically to enlightenment and perfection. There is the slow way and the fast way. The slow way is the slow ladder, where you go step by step and you look at something and you try to micromanage it. So, you say you have an ethical characteristic you need to change, and you work on it bit by bit, and you're always catching yourself. And that's good. And no one who's going to say that's a bad thing. It's a very good thing. And sometimes it is the only route ahead of you. However, there is also a fast track to zooming forward to this sort of spiritual perfection. And that is through the love and relationship with and allegiance to a great spiritual figure like Ali ibn Abi Talib, peace be upon him. And if that genuine sort of openness and link is there, then this will pull you towards them and make you similar to them, like Salman al-Farsi, like Abu Dhar. It wasn't that they simply micromanaged their ethics and their spirituality, although I'm sure they did, but also this added link brings them closer to the ideals embodied by these people, or indeed the ideals of Allah, and thus they also have a special connection to the speaking Quran, as we can inshallah do that too. And so inshallah we can all benefit both from the physical and written book of Allah, and also through our relationship and knowledge of the speaking of Allah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Amina. In those, again, questions will wait, so please stay on. And you can mute. I think we can have less wind coming from wherever you are. Our third speaker, Dr. Hassan Abbas. Dr. Hassan Abbas is Distinguished Professor of International Relations at the Near East South Asian Strategic Studies Center, National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He serves as a senior advisor at Project on Shiism and Global Affairs at Harvard University. His current research focuses on building narratives for countering political and religious extremism and rule of law reforms in developing states. Previously, he served as a professor and chair of the Department of Regional and Analytical Studies at National Defense University's College of International Security Affairs in Washington, D.C. There are numerous other credentials we can speak of, but I think most relevant is Professor Abbas's new book, which I hope people will get to read. I look forward to reading it myself, which is to confess I haven't had a chance to read it as yet. This is, I think, published by Yale Press. This just came out in March 2021. The Prophet's Heir, The Life of Ali ibn Abi Talib. This provides a portrait of Ali ibn Talib, the man who assumed the spiritual mentor of Islam to spearhead the movement that the Prophet had led. His previous book was The Taliban Revival, published in 2014, chronicles the Taliban's survival and resurgence after 2001. So I don't know. I hope we'll get to hear kind of a trailer or a prelude to the book as well of what it contains, and or maybe some comments from it. But up to you.
Thank you so much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Really honored and humbled to be in this great company of scholars. I value and respect each one of them immensely, and I've benefited from their scholarship, and in one case, especially with Suleiman, his direct guidance in a great fashion. Also, I'm very thankful to the organizer, especially Hassan Rizvi. For framing my arguments today and focusing on one specific aspect, this morning I was looking at all the newspapers and the major news headlines. And I thought, just in a humble way, if I place myself through the eyes of the Imam, if I may, he being the leader, what would have attracted him the most? So as to think about the relevance of Imam Ali alayhi salam's teachings, ideals, worldview, philosophy in a contemporary sense. Of course, all what we think about, whether spirituality or his linkage to Quran, as the two honorable speakers mentioned, it's also contemporary. But I was looking at the socio-political environment in the world today. And I thought, is there anything which will get his attention the most? And frankly, two news items just pop up in front of me. And I would like to link the idea of what I think as Imam Ali is one of the most important messages, which is not so often getting the requisite importance. And that's why I will highlight those, but through the lens of this ideals. And there was two news stories. One is in Kabul yesterday in Afghanistan, where a suicide attack or a terrorist attack killed young children. This was a mosque called Mosque Shohada al-Islam, or Mosque Sayyid al-Shohada, in the name of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. And the 50 young kids who died, most of them are young girls, grade 6th, 7th, 8th, belonging to the local Hazara community. And that really hit me. I think my Imam, who I think has inspired my thinking and all of our thinking, would have really focused on that immediately. While in that region, I could have picked any region in the world and picked stories. But the other news story, because I'm from South Asia, originally from Pakistan, I follow Pakistani newspaper in Indian and one as well. The other news story that got my attention was in Peshawar, Pakistan, where the local police found 12 young kids sleeping on the road because they were doled out on a contract to be used for begging. And these are 5-year-old or 6-year-old kids. And tomorrow somebody else will contract them to use them for begging. And the reason I picked these up was also one of the findings from my book or my humble research on Imam Ali, which was his love for the very poor and those who are the oppressed, who are at the lowest strata of society. His love and his priority for what the most poor of the poor believe in or were going through, I think was his most important priority. And I would like to expand on that theme and in a way establish from his statements, his life as a caliph, his life as an imam, or his life as a ordinary person in a sense in that community as well. And to establish that whether we talk about his political worldview or his philosophy of governance, which is extremely important, his philosophy or his work on leadership, what a leader should look like. Most of his sermons or many of his sermons talked about it, or whether we talk about the spirituality or any other aspect of the Imam, one thing that was closest to his heart, and I'm emphasizing in my humble view, the closest was the plight of the very poor. Why this is important is often if you would discuss it in a community, not of scholars, but ordinary Muslims, who the general feeling would be, or the discussion points would often be about his political role or his right, which is extremely important. He was himself very clear. and he said it so many times, where even the political leadership stood, but also we would think of the political sphere in a sense of futuristic one. I would say that this demand or this urge of Muslims always to think about empire building in some shape or form, or power structures. We so often think of great Islamic personalities not necessarily in terms of the movement that they had brought and what were the symbols of those movements, but we often think of power structures and authority, and believe that if there was authority that had come to these great personalities of Imam and Ali and his descendants, things would have been different, or perhaps that was the purpose or aim or a desire or even a demand of the Islamic system. And I want to say that's not the case. The topic or the focus of these great personalities, especially Imam Ali in this case, was the well-being and the welfare of the very ordinary. And how I go about that, I will begin with his first statement when he became, or he was invited. Actually, people had rushed to his door begging him to take over, which was so different from every other case. It was not because necessarily they thought of him that who will be a great governor. They had not seen his leadership capabilities in a sense as a governor or administrator. Why people went to him in such a passionate fashion, begging him, even those who had stood silent when he was sidelined or isolated from political sphere. They went to him, I argue, because they could see that there will be an element of fairness and justice. And when we talk about element of fairness and justice, it's not necessarily, and I speak now as wearing my hat as a political scientist, it's not about justice in a sense of structures. It is about the rights of the very ordinary. It is about the accountability of the leaders so that the rights of the very poor are taken care of, because they are the ones who benefit the most from a justice system. An elitist society and the elites of the society would never benefit from justice in a sense, because they are the ones who are the privileged. It is the very poor who benefit from justice. Even I would link the idea of justice to the rights of the very poor. But the first statement, and Dr. Rizwan, I must say, when I started in my passion, I didn't look at the watch. If you can tell me I'm 4 minutes in so that I stick to the 15-minute.
That's fine. You're 5 minutes in.
5 minutes in, good, good. So 2:33, perfect, thank you. So the first statement that that got my attention was when he was asked to lead as the caliph, and he said, "I aspire to restore the true symbols of Islam, usher in prosperity, and secure peace so that the oppressed have no fear." I'm quoting from translation of his statement. I read it again. "I aspire to restore the true symbols of Islam, usher in prosperity, and secure peace so that the oppressed have no fear." So the ultimate goal of everything else that he has mentioned is to save those who are oppressed. Also, at the same time, another statement of Imam Ali is coming to my mind, which I'm also reading from my recent work. Thank you for mentioning that. Which was Will Durant, his most monumental work, The Story of Civilization. In his one of those actually, you may be able to see that the very colorful books behind me are the I think 11 volumes of Will Durant. In his The Age of Faith, I highly encourage everyone to read that. He says that when Imam Ali became the caliph, the biggest challenge was, in his words, now I quote, he says, that depicted his dilemma, and now his quotes, "Genial and charitable, mediative and reserved, he shrank from a drama in which religion had been displaced by politics and devotion by intrigue," unquote. Because these were the things that were not attractive to him. I go to the next point when he was asked again to serve as the leader, and this was one of his the very first sermon actually. He starts the first sermon in the Masjid-e-Kufa by saying, actually not in Masjid-e-Kufa, but his first sermon. He said, "O people, I'm one of you. I enjoy the same rights that you enjoy. My responsibilities are also the same as yours." Again, a very clear indication of how he looked at his responsibility. And he had also mentioned in his very first statement. He said, "Now hear me carefully." I'm quoting him. "I hereby proclaim that I shall stop these individuals that have abused public funds in the state treasury by diverting funds in order to build large estates and dig streams, and etc., etc." He said, "The accountability will begin tomorrow. Whatever is the legal right will remain with them, but everything else beyond that will return to the state treasury." Unquote. And what he did with the treasury, within the first week, by all records, he tasked his top aide, Ubaidullah, if I remember the name correctly, and he said to him, "Start distributing treasury funds among the people and provide 3 dinars to everyone." I'm reading from a major source. And he said, whether migrants or Ansar, or for that matter, anyone else, nothing less, nothing more. And then he said, when he was told how outrageous the elite was, he said, "I am not here to take care of the rights of the elite. I'm here to take care of the rights of the very poor." And this was a phenomenal decision. This was a revolution in itself. And this was exactly what the Prophet of Islam, Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, used to do. He was just bringing it back. To give credit where due, the first caliph, Abu Bakr, also followed it, at least for some time, the same principle. But in case he after that, there was a gap, and especially during the time of the third caliph. So the point I'm making is that Imam Ali's the love, the passion for him was also linked to these ideas of his support for the very poor and the oppressed, and those who have nothing on their side to defend. Now I'll quote a few other things. Also, another statement of Imam Ali, which establishes this point further. During his early days as caliph, he had said, "I can't be happy to be called commander of the faithful unless I share the hardships suffered by the poorest of the poor." And that was the hallmark of his time as the leader, that he ensured that he will live as the very, very poor. And by the way, for his support for the poor, it mattered not at all what the person, what group or school of thought or political position that person had. There was this famous case where he's walking through a street and he finds an ordinary person who happened to be a Christian, who was very old, and he was begging, and he stopped everyone, called and said to them, "You were making best use of this person's abilities and energy when he was young, and now that he is poor, you have made him beg." This is one of the another examples of why Ali was loved not only by the people who were his supporters or who believed in his leadership as loyal to him. It was beyond any religious dimension, any sectarian. Sectarian is a word that came afterwards, but any of his loyalists meant nothing to him. And that became so obvious when so many of his close associates, including his brother, would go to him. And he would always say, "You're asking me to trample upon the rights of the very poor?" This was his standard slogan. And I feel, maybe it is my ignorance and lack of awareness, I have not seen this dimension of Imam Ali. It has almost become a hidden dimension for the fact that this is not emphasized enough. And I want to briefly talk about why this is not emphasized enough. But just after a few more quotes from various places that I collected. Some of these are in my book. Some are from a previous booklet I'd worked on, Imam Ali's leadership, Imam Ali on leadership and governance. And I just will read out in a minute or so. His special care of the orphans was well known. He was known as the father of the orphans. Again, everything about him reminds you of the Prophet, peace be upon him, because he, in every possible manner, he was the true reflection of the Prophet. Also, look at his letter to Malik al-Ashtar, I think one of the most prominent and significant documents on political system. I've said this before. I often read comments from this letter to my students in classes on Islam and political Islam and modern Middle East politics. And I tell them, okay, what do you think? Who said this? And some will say it's Socrates or Aristotle. Others would say, as if the light has come to their mind, they would say, oh, of course, it is Thomas Jefferson. And then I would say, no, this is Ali ibn Abi Talib, 1400 years ago. Because reading that letter will will open anyone's mind. For instance, his focus on, he had said, a part of when he's telling Malik al-Ashtar how to spend his day, he's saying a part of leaders, and I'm quoting now, a part of a leader's day should be exclusively dedicated to hearing the complaints and grievances of the public. A leader should always be accessible to the public for this purpose, and such hearings should be in the open. All complainants should be treated with kindness, courtesy, and respect. No officials of the state should be in the audience at that occasion, so that complainants can freely speak and without any fear. In such gatherings, it is expected, he further says, that those whose rights have been violated may speak harshly and in anger. Such an attitude must be tolerated with patience and forbearance. So he's ready to be the most kindest to those who are very, very poor. Then also in the same statement, his talk about the regular communication with the people was very, very important. I'll just conclude in the last 1 minute that I have and say, this also tells us why the elites of the time and why his opponents and enemies had most serious trouble with him. I would say they perhaps had little trouble with his other dimensions of religious worldview. They had, but by and large, not. They had issues with his egalitarianism. They had issues with his idea of welfare of the people. They had challenges in terms of his love for the very ordinary, because they believed in tribalism. They believed in elitism. The enemies of Ali are the enemies of the very ordinary Muslims. That's the point that comes out, I think, very clearly, and I thought in this limited time I would emphasize that. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Back to you, Doctor.
All right, thank you. All right, so our final speaker, Dr. Maulana Suleiman Ali Hassan. I don't know, we don't see you. Is it possible to see you? Did you? All right.
I hope so.
Yes. Dr. Sayyid Suleiman Hassan Abdi, he is the director at the Baitul Ilm Academy in Illinois. He graduated from University of Buffalo with a degree in business administration, but then proceeded to the seminary at Qom in 1997. In Qom, where he studied for 10 years, he specialized in fiqh and history, returned to the United States, then got a PhD from University of Chicago in Near Eastern Studies. And since then, or during this time, he has been the president of the Ahlul Bayt Islamic Seminary in Streamwood, Illinois. He also served as the religious director of the Imam-e-Asr Islamic Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. I think he's also translator of Adle Ilahi of Ayatollah Mutahari, one book, and regularly gives speeches during Muharram. And it's so wonderful to see you. Please.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you to the organizers of this event for the opportunity and for the previous speakers. I think much of value has already been said about the taqwa and devotion of Imam Ali, about the nature of the written Quran and the lived Quran, which is Imam Ali and Ahlul Bayt, and about the nature of the justice-seeking message of Imam Ali to the understanding of Islam that many other Muslims may have had. And that's where I would like to begin my brief remarks. And recognizing that I am the fourth speaker, and I'm sure the audience is also interested in the interactive session of the program, I'll try to be as concise as possible. But if we take our imagination back to the success of Islam that was perhaps unexpected even to the vast majority of Muslims towards the end of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life. When people are entering into Islam in large groups, entire tribes are entering into Islam all at once. And the previously underestimated Arabs are able to assert their material power, even in territory that previously had been under the influence of Rome or Persia. What would the average Muslim have seen as the way in which the continued expansion and success of Islam is going to play out. The Quran gives a very heavy prediction and promise to the Muslims. هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون. The Quran says that Allah sent His messenger with guidance and with the true way, the true law, or the true religion, ليظهره على الدين كله, so that it will vanquish or it will overcome all forms of devotion, all religions, even though the polytheists may be averse. And it might be natural for Muslims to have seen the expansion of Islam and the military and the political authority of Islam to assume that it was going to be in that same military or political sense that the authority of Islam, the overpowering of Islam is going to take place. And that is actually what many conventional Muslim historians have done. When they look at the Prophet's life, they will focus on maghazi, on the battles of the Prophet. When they speak of a golden age of Islam, they speak of conquests, expansion of territory, the Muslim world expanding within a century from the Atlantic Ocean all the way into India and then Central Asia. So there is clearly a sense that this is a reflection of that divine promise, that Islam is going to succeed, Islam is going to spread, and we can see the seeds of that success in this expansion of the Islamic empire and the successes that the Muslim armies had in defeating Rome and Persia and then lands further beyond. And that is a misunderstanding of the nature of Islam and the victory of Islam, but it was widespread. If we can kind of relate it to our own personal experience, maybe many of us, we may have had an easy time in high school because you don't need to know how to study. You don't need to have good work habits in order to succeed in high school. If you're present in class, if you pay attention, you're reasonably intelligent, then you can get a decent grade and maybe even an excellent grade in high school. And so a lot of people, they assume that, well, their attendance and their wits are sufficient to succeed. And then they come into college and maybe they have that one difficult science course and they think they're doing well. They have their first test or midterm and all of a sudden they realize that they're failing the course because they thought something was going to be the source of their success that doesn't translate well in that new environment. And so Muslims in the youth of Islam, so to speak, they had a similar kind of a problem. And one of the things that I think the message of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam in totality, but in particular Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam, gives us is a very different idea of what the nature of the Islamic message is and what the secret of the success of Islam is. When God says لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ, that Islam is going to spread and is going to vanquish all other laws, all other forms of devotion, all false doctrines and practices and beliefs, then it's not a conquest. It's not a military victory, but rather a moral victory. And this is illustrated right at the time of when the tide turned in Islam. Conquest of Makkah, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the history. Prophet ﷺ brings an army up to 10,000, but he doesn't bring that army for battle. In fact, when one of his lieutenants, Sa'd ibn Ubadah, says, Al-Yawm Yawmul Malhama, this is going to be the day of a battle, of vengeance against these people who have been enemies of Islam, the Prophet says, Al-Yawm Yawmul Marhama, this is a day of mercy. When Abu Sufyan, who was the chief of the opponents of Makkah, sees that army, he turns to the Prophet's uncle, Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, and says, لَقَدْ أَصْبَحَ مُلْكُ ابْنِ أَخِيكَ الْغَدَاةَ عَظِيمًا. Your nephew's kingdom has been made very great. It's a great kingdom. Arabia had seen kingdoms in Abyssinia, in Yemen, in Persia, in Rome, but it wasn't a land that was a home to kingdoms or to kings. And then, perhaps a little exasperated, Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib responds, إِنَّهَا النُّبُوَّةِ. This is prophethood, it's not a kingdom. And Abu Sufyan is reported to have said, Na'am idhan. Perhaps also exasperated, yes, I get it, fine, prophethood, call it what you will. But that represents the nature of this disconnect. Unfortunately, Abu Sufyan's misconception has influenced even how many Muslims think of the nature of Islamic law and society. And so Imam Ali, perhaps not more so than the other aspects of his life that we can talk about, but certainly very vividly contrasts with this kind of a perception. And right after the Prophet's death, Imam Ali was approached first by his uncle, Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, according to a narration, that why don't you stretch out your hand, let me pledge allegiance. If I pledge allegiance to you, then nobody is going to dispute. I am the Prophet's uncle, I am a senior figure in Quraysh. This is going to prevent a fitna, and it would have probably prevented the commotion that took place in the days and weeks after the Prophet passed away. And then when the events in Saqifa took place, Abu Sufyan himself came and said that this is not an acceptable course of action. I'm willing to support your candidacy to lead the Muslim world. He came to Imam Ali. And in both cases, Imam Ali refused those offers of support. Abbas's offer was sincere, and Abu Sufyan's may have had many other motives behind it, but in one level, at least in a tribal sense, it was probably an actual frustration with the idea that somebody who had no experience and in the tribal logic had no right to rule was selected as the caliph or as the leader of the Muslims. What does Imam Ali's response tell us? It tells us that Imam Ali was looking not to the immediate day or week in the future, that, well, is there going to be a commotion in Saqifa? Is there going to be another figure put forward? Imam Ali was looking farther in the future, but also deeper into the reality of Islam. And as our previous speakers have also indicated in numerous incidents, what he was saying is, in effect, that this is not the point. For me to be recognized as the political leader of the Muslim world is not the point. For Muslims to know that they are to seek guidance and leadership and make their political and their outward worldly decisions in light of religious knowledge and guidance is the point. And so for me to bring myself in a task that's already been accomplished and which people don't have the time to contemplate and decide why they are pledging allegiance to me, that will defeat the purpose. Many of them may accept my authority because of a family relationship, because influential people within the tribe have done so, or because now they want to get part and be part of that political system, but they will not do so for the reasons of serving and sacrificing for the truth. And so this is perhaps one of the things that we can most immediately learn from Imam Ali, that there is an alternative conception of what Islam is and what makes Islam great, and what the victory of Islam, even in an outward sense, is based on. And that is that it is based on an inward battle of self-purification and then reforming society and purifying society on the basis of that inward battle. And there's two statements attributed to Imam Ali that I would just like to review that are a good illustration of this point. One is found in Nahj al-Balagha as well, and I'm sure many of you have heard it. Imam Ali was asked, which is better, justice or generosity, adl or jud? And Imam Ali said that justice is better than generosity, even though he was the most generous person. But he said that al-adl yada'u al-umura mawadi'aha. When you are just, then you're putting things in their proper place. Wal-jud yukhrijuha min jihatiha. And when you're generous, then you're taking something out of its proper place because you're giving extra to somebody. Wal-adlu sa'isun am. So justice is something that can apply to everyone. Wal-jud aridun khas. That generosity is something that can be applied in specific cases. In other words, justice exists on its own, but generosity only is possible if we know what everyone deserves, and then we give people out of our generosity or for a specific reason more than they deserve. But if I don't know, if I'm grading, a classroom after a project, if I don't have a rubric, if I don't know how to assign a fair grade, then I can't be generous in my grading. So you need justice even for mercy or for generosity to have meaning. And that is an illustration of Imam Ali's focus. It was on justice. And the second statement is perhaps even more surprising. The Imam was asked, Al-adl afdal am al-shaja'a? It's narrated that Imam Ali was asked, is justice better or courage? And Imam Ali, of course, was at the time known and is today known as the most courageous of the warriors of Islam. In fact, for many people, Imam Ali is the hero of Badr and Uhud and the later battles of Islam. But when he was asked, it's reported that Imam Ali says, Al-adlu afdal min al-shaja'a. Justice is better even than courage. لأن الناس لو استعملوا العدل عموما في جميعهم لاستغنوا عن الشجاعة. Because if everybody were just, then you wouldn't have battle and you wouldn't need to show that particular kind of courage, which is valor in battle. And so although he was known for his courage, Imam Ali said that I would rather a world where we didn't need to show at least that kind of battlefield courage. And for me, that's one of the most beautiful, one of the most relevant messages of Imam Ali, because whether we approach it from a religious perspective or from a secular perspective, in many cases, when we want to change the world or reform the world, we're looking outward. We're looking in the world of politics, electoral campaigns, who to vote for, candidates, or in the religious world, we're also looking at external actions that we can do. And Imam Ali reminds us and teaches us how to be concerned for that global reform, but to do so by starting within through purification. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Suleiman. Hassan Sahab, how much time do we have? Because I think we're already somewhat over time. So there are questions that have come from our listeners or people who are on YouTube. But how much time do we have? And I also want to ask scholars. If
it's up to you. It's up to you and the panelists how much time you want to spend.
All right. So asking the panelists, is it all right? Can we take few questions, maybe 10 to 15 minutes at most? I know your time is precious. Will that be all right? 10 to 15 minutes?
Certainly, should be fine.
All right. So the numerous questions that have come, I have tried to compile them and first wanted to look at those questions which seem at least tendentially related to the comments made by our speakers. So I'll begin with those, and then if we have time, we can go on and discuss other things. So there are at least 20 questions here. So first question, and you're all welcome. I think it's easier to recognize whose talk is under consideration here. I was curious when it comes to the various dimensions of Imam Ali, alayhi salam, is there really a difference when we view Imam Ali from a spiritual point of view as opposed to a political science or a scholar's perspective?
I can briefly start off. I know others are more qualified to answer that, but I would say all the different aspects of Imam Ali's life gel and they speak to each other. Each one is linked as linked in a beautiful whole. So whether it was spirituality is in the awareness about the transcendent reality, that's what is shown through his worldview in more of a political sense. The political scientists have not spent as much time in the West looking at Imam Ali the way they should have, but some of the few works that we have from the Muslim scholars very clearly link Imam Ali's ideas of justice and his love for egalitarianism to the very essence of Islam, which is, and especially the ideas of egalitarianism. That's how I would put it. Thank you.
Professor Takim, do you also want to address this question?
Yeah, very briefly. Every person has got different angles of perspective to that person. Someone to him or herself. Some people are more geared towards justice. Some people are deeply spiritual, etc. I think I addressed this issue, which was that Imam Ali has different perspectives. And Professor Hassan is right that they do gel together. But there are those who, shall we say, are more enamored and pulled by a particular aspect. There are those who just love the justice of Imam Ali. There are those who are more perhaps fond of or more connected with the spirituality. Now, that doesn't mean that it is either this or that. They are all together, but there's just one aspect may appeal to us more than other, depending on our own inclination. You know, apart from that is the morals and the etiquettes of Imam Ali also, which we need to talk about. Is the way his chivalry and bravery and honesty and faithfulness. These are other dimensions also that one can, you can have lectures and lectures on just one dimension.
Dr. Inlows, do you want to say anything or we move on to the next question?
Okay, well, that's already very comprehensive. Imam Ali, peace be upon him, was a very holistic person. That there is definitely a unity between his actions in all aspects of his life and his ideals, and in part that's because he had a single ideology and viewpoint and orientation, whereas sometimes other people were drawn in several directions at once. But sometimes people who study political science or history, they take, or especially in this day and age, they sometimes take a more materialistic approach to, or materialist approach to these things. So they look at a leader in terms of how did he or she, and usually it's a he, how do they best promote their kingship or try to get the most land or win the most battles. So in that regard, not everyone might look at this the same way, because they might say he's not someone who made the best decisions to get the most territory or to always vanquish the most enemies. But this is a different sort of evaluation, because it's not looking at him spanning the spiritual and material considerations or this world and the akhirah, or as someone who is trying to embody a divine message. And as a matter of fact, not to get on my soapbox here, but when we look at some of the expansion of the early Arab Muslim Empire outside of the time of Imam Ali and the Prophet, just like the caliphs or whatever you want to call them, the leaders, they were successful at building an empire and gaining territory, but sometimes this was to the detriment of the faith long term, or to the sort of the setting aside of some ethical considerations, whereas Imam Ali would put the ethical considerations of war over other concerns. And even in this day and age, most countries don't put the ethical considerations above war. We have nuclear bombs in this era. So I would say in and of himself, he's united, but sometimes people on the outside, if they have a different scale for things, they might look at things differently, even if they look at all of us differently. Like, why is Amina not doing as much as she can to get as much money as she can? Or why are you not doing something, etc.? And it's because we have different priorities.
Second question, this seems like connected to Professor Takim's comments, Dr. Suleiman's comments, and a little bit Dr. Indo's. Is there a special method to really understand not only Allah, but also our own inner meaning through Imam Ali? So it's a bit of an esoteric question, but I think
who is this addressed to?
It's not no question is addressed to anyone in particular. It has come from Chicago.
Yeah, maybe we should ask Dr. Suleiman Molana, because he hasn't spoken, and plus he's also from Chicago. So,
but also your talk was on spirituality of Imam Ali, so I thought maybe this is about.
I will be happy to, but I think he hasn't spoken, so let him respond.
Sure, I'll begin, and then our other guests, inshallah, can add their insights. This is one of those topics that's quite difficult to speak about, because you need to have the spirituality of Imam Ali, or at least a whiff of that spirituality, to be able to speak of it beyond describing something that you've learned about, which is what I can do, but not really more than that. But perhaps one of the best ways is to focus on something that we often neglect, which is the practice and the participation. So in my generation, I've seen a lot of people, when they come and they commemorate Imam Ali or the lives of the family of the Prophet in birth and in occasions of grief, they'll often describe that the program has poetry in the beginning and maybe a lecture, and then perhaps poetry, morning, a ziyarah at the end. And so some people with limited time, they'll come for the lecture, and they might come a little bit late and they might leave a little bit early. And when we have limited time, we have to make choices. I would almost say that if you have limited time, come for the poetry, because that's something that is that's best done with other believers. A lecture, as many of us have done by necessity because of COVID, you can listen to it online. And in many cases, thinking back to my youth, I don't remember all of the lectures that I've listened to, but those poetic or those performative parts of the remembrance of Imam Ali and Ahlul Bayt more generally, they sometimes can still move me and inspire me and transport me back to a better state. So this is by no means a comprehensive answer, but just to get the conversation started, I think this is one thing that we often neglect, because we think that we know something when we've read it, mastered it, we filed it away somewhere in our brain. But that doesn't mean that we actually know Imam Ali or that we are connected to him. And that doesn't mean that we are close to God. But when we do, when we perform, and when we are present and participate with others who are also serving the same goal, then we often have a much more real and a more sustained connection. And I'll leave it at that for our other guests to add to, inshallah.
Please do not feel forced. We have plenty of questions, so we can move on to the next question. If someone has something to say, happy to. Otherwise, we can move on to the next question.
I think maybe we can move on to other questions, so we kind of deal with more people.
All right. So, is there a gap between the speaking Quran and the silent Quran? We have seen that in history over time, those who have adhered to just the silent Quran are doing just fine and are seemingly successful. What am I looking at incorrectly?
I guess that's to me. I don't think we're doing just fine. There's a lot of chaos in the Muslim world, especially the past century. I mean, you've got people like ISIS coming out there and defending themselves according to their interpretation of the Quran and Hadith. I know wife beaters who defend themselves by the Quran. I know people who do. Yeah, I'm not saying I'm not trying to be negative about Islam. This happens in every faith. There are a lot of very good people, with a lot of spiritual insight, contributing members of society who. Who just, who have their own interpretations of the Quran throughout history and today. But I'm just saying that it's not all there all the time. And whether we look in the early history of Islam or middle history or today, there have been things that have been gone wrong by some people who misused or even just misunderstood the Quran. And even it happens today. People get an idea about what it says and then they make very bad decisions. Through their ignorance. It's one of the scarier warnings of the Quran that should Allah tell you of those who have lost the most. It's those who think they're doing good when they're actually doing the worst things. And I think I mentioned modernity because it's really in about the 20th century that we see to what degree some perhaps shallow or two-dimensional or static or in some ways misguided interpretations of Islam, so that is to say the Quran and Hadith, have not been able to sustain a healthy society, and there has been a push to try to to take another look at certain things and to maybe fix up things where we might have gotten a little bit off track. Again, not saying every interpretation is wrong, but I'm just saying that basically I don't agree with the viewpoint there. I also think as human beings, we are in need of a human example. I mean, that's why we look to the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him and his family. I mean, of course, he's not physically here, but that's why we have a Sunnah, or that's why we have people like Imam Ali, because we need to somehow copy. Like I'm gonna give an example. Back in the olden days, I used to teach Islamic studies at high school level. God help me, and I hope none of my ex-students are listening here, but I would find this interesting, and I found this in lecturing too, that you can teach a subject and you can test them on an exam on the factual knowledge. They can get the question right, but if it's about, say, some sort of ethical issue, they won't necessarily be implementing it at all, even though they can repeat your words. It's just something about how the brain works. As human beings, we learn behavior through seeing and modeling, much more so than theoretical knowledge, which then requires a sort of interpretive process. Sometimes the theoretical knowledge is all we have, so we do our best. But human nature does work better with the lived example in one way or another. So I do believe that, if I can even extend that, the speaking Quran is important, both in terms of the Sunnah of the Prophet and people like Imam Ali, peace be upon them, but also in the traditional methods of passing on the religion in our tradition. Because whether it's in the scholarly tradition or other ways, because there is a modeling of the faith. Again, not to say everything traditional is right, but it shows how it can be lived instead of just speaking about how it can be lived. So that's my answer in brief.
All right, thank you. And another question, I think it's relatively clearer who it is for. How would Imam Ali have viewed colonialism and capitalism? If we look at it from a point of view, from Islamic point of view, how would Imam Ali have viewed the current system of democracy, for example, in the US? Any positive points or perhaps shortcomings, not in terms of implementation alone, but in theory as well. So democracy, colonialism, capitalism, from Imam Ali's point of view. Professor Hassan Abbas, do you
I
think?
will-
That's what I thought that you seem to be.
That's true. I mean, I was waiting for the cue. I mean, it's a hard question, but what is the easiest part of this is colonialism. No, absolutely, straight away. The way other people are oppressed, I would add colonialism and imperialism in the modern context. That's a big no. That stands against everything that Islam stands for. I think Imam Ali would have been a big challenger to this. I often think which political group or political personality he would have liked. I know it can be controversial what I'm about to say, but maybe Bernie Sanders. When I say this, I mean the emphasis on the pushback to inequality and injustice and the discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. Democracy becomes more complicated, but I would argue, in my personal opinion, anything which represents an enlightened view of the majority of the people would be a shape or form of democratic order, provided it has the right kind of guidance. And it's not free for all, where we have seen the dominant groups with any political ideology can manipulate it. So democracy, but with an element of more guidance. I think that's what Imam would have supported. Capitalism, I'm not an economist, that's a more complicated thing. Some of the signs of capitalism, which are about hoarding money and manipulating through wealth, would certainly be a no-no. But I know there are various viewpoints on that issue, so I'm not, frankly, I need to learn more about that. But on democracy and a big capital no to colonialism and imperialism. Thank you.
Anyone else like to add anything?
I think we need to understand, of course, without going to great details because of the time constraints, Imam Ali would always be with the Quran. Whatever the Quran says, the Imam would endorse on it. As far as the forms of government is concerned, I mean, I agree with Dr. Abbas when he says that, capitalism, imperialism, no. I mean, colonialism, imperialism, no. But when it comes to forms of government, the Quran does not outline any particular form of government. It outlines the purpose of a government. And the purpose of a government is that of a just social order or a society based on justice and equality. As long as there is no kind of exploitation, human beings are able to express themselves, and provided it does not violate the boundaries of the Sharia, Amir al-Mu'mineen would be okay with it, my understanding.
All right, so this will be the last question, and everyone is invited. It's not a question based on your comments or your remarks in the beginning. It's a very open question. What is the best way to promote or introduce Imam Ali to the mainstream society besides our own akhlaq? So this came from New York. Trying any society, maybe you.
Can I start so that then the others can follow? I can give you a personal anecdote, okay? Again, very briefly, here in Canada, the Ontario court system has an opening session at the beginning of the new year. And January 6th, 1993, if I remember correctly, they invited me to speak. And coincidentally, it was also the 13th of Rajab. So who else would you go and speak to the judges, to the superior court, apart from Imam Ali? And I talked to them very briefly about the letters of Malik al-As and so on. And the Chief Justice came to me later on. He said, "You have done a great injustice to Imam Ali." I said, "Why?" Just because you have hidden him. You have never told us about him. Who was this man? And that in a nutshell tells us what our response is. It's nice and dandy for us to come and talk about it here, but we all know Amir al-Mu'mineen. What we need to do is talk about him and explain to others, especially non-Muslims, of who he was. He wasn't just a saintly figure. Yes, he was that, but he was more than that. Amir al-Mu'mineen's life is one which can touch each and every human being's part, human being's life in one way or another. And therefore, whether it is through newspapers, through the politics, any form through the TV, social media, we should be talking about Amir al-Mu'mineen, not only to ourselves, but more importantly, to others.
So everyone is invited to this last question, and that will be the conclusion of our discussion.
I think there's a lot to be said for artistic expressions, whether it's painting or poetry, as was mentioned, sacred recitations, short film, not to bore people, but a short film, which are accessible to the metaphor of the people who are watching it or listening to it, or in a way that's understandable that they can plug into and relate. Because there is a certain emotion or passion or understanding that comes through the arts that is difficult to express just through regular intellectual discourse. Although again, they go hand in hand. So I think that is an excellent route to use because you understand not only who someone is, but who they mean to someone. I was debating whether or not to share this because it contains an inappropriate word. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I do think this website has probably done a better job of introducing Imam Ali to the world than any other one. You might be smiling because you know what it is. Let me just share it so I don't have to say it. This says it all. I think about it a lot. And he goes down. And this is not a Muslim page. It's just about kind of awesome people throughout history. Did stuff like beat up drug dealers and so forth. And he's got Imam Ali here, and he talks about Zulfiqar and the battles. And when you hear sometimes outside of the Islamic context people talking about these things, there's sort of a, oh wow, those Muslims are so uncivilized. They were fighting battles and they're not turning the other cheek. And this guy is not doing it. I mean, yeah, the wording's a little bit rough, although nothing compared to what we have nowadays. But it's all glowing and positive, and it's factually accurate. And I just want to point out that, I guess, sometimes we never know what direction discussions are going to come from, and sometimes it is that sort of casual way. But beyond that, I would recommend artistic expressions, whether it's the visual or performing arts, if you will.
Dr. Rizwan, can I,
Yeah.
from this idea of artistic expression and what Maulana Suleiman had said, can I recite a short Urdu poetry? It will not take more than a minute.
Please, go ahead.
Because it is in response to what was just said and earlier as well.
Hopefully with translation, I guess.
That will be hard. Okay, I'll try to at least give the gist. That makes sense. This is from Iftikhar Arif, a well-known poet in Pakistan, who's from the Ahl Sunnah, Sunni school of thought. And he said, "Shehr ilm ke darwaze par," on the door of knowledge. Kabhi kabhi dil ye sochta hai, na jane hum beyaqeen logon ko naam-e Haidar se rabt kyun hai. Hakim jane wo kaisi hikmat se aashna tha, शजी जाने के बद्र खैबर की फतह मंदी का राज क्या था, अलीम जाने वो इल्म के कौन से सफीनों का ना खुदा था, मुझे तो बस सिर्फ ये खबर है वो मेरे मौला की खुशबुओं में रचा बसा था, वो उनके दामाने आतिफत में पला बढ़ा था और उसके दिन रात मेरे आका के चश्मो अब्रो जुम्बिशे लब के मुंतजर थे, वो रात को दुश्मनों के नरगे में सो रहा था तो उनकी खातिर, जदाल में सर से पांव तक सुर्ख हो रहा था तो उनकी खातिर, सो उसको महबूब जानता हूँ, सो उसको मकसूद मानता हूँ, सादतें उसी के नाम से हैं, मोहब्बतें उसी के नाम से हैं, मोहब्बतों के सभी घरानों की निस्बतें उसी के नाम से हैं. Thank you for the opportunity.
Suleiman Saab, I think you have the final word, and that will be the conclusion.
So were we going to get a brief translation of the gist?
Absolutely, I can try. You can do it better than me if you want to say in a few words, or you. I can.
No, please do, because I was listening, but I don't have it in front of me.
Absolutely true. So it basically the title of this point is Shehr ilm ke darwaze par, on the door of knowledge, and then the argument is that we don't know why we have a certain passion and love for the name of Ali, and then he tries to respond. Only the knowledgeable knows what his wisdom was. Only the brave know about his chivalry and bravery. Only those who have a special knowledge can see what his esoteric dimensions were. He said, those are the traits with those specialized people, knowledgeable but would know. But I only know that Ali was so close to the Prophet and he was so loyal and so beloved of the Prophet. And he says, that's what all that matters to me. Whether he was sleeping in a crisis situation, it was for the Prophet. Whether he was fighting, it was for the love of the Prophet. He says, so that's why I love him. That's why I want to be associated with him. And that's why all these spiritual associations with him matter a lot. That's the rough translation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I fully endorse everything that was said, so I don't need to reiterate it. But I think in particular, poetry and artistic expression are very important, because one of the reasons why some people, they come for the lecture and they skip the poetry is because the poetry is in a language or an idiom that they may not fully relate to. And that's now a task for everyone inspired by Imam Ali to create forms of visual or oral expression that can be relatable and that sometimes can be an anchor for our other ways of honoring Imam Ali and Ahlul Bayt. Another thing I think, I'll just say two things very quickly. One is that we sometimes, associate Imam Ali with Nahj al-Balagha, but Nahj al-Balagha is a very selected subset of what has been attributed to Imam Ali, and a big part of Imam Ali's life are his du'as and his munajat. So we need to connect to what has come down to us from Imam Ali's words and expressions. Nahj al-Balagha is not just a book for us to take pride in, that it exists somewhere over there and we have it, but rather for us to connect to. And then in addition to that, the du'as of Imam Ali. And that relates to the second and final point, which is that, as was said during the course of our program today, to not compartmentalize our devotion and our religiosity. In many cases, we kind of have like a religious frame of mind, and then we have a secular frame of mind, maybe subconsciously. And it's not just about akhlaq, but if we can consider the inspiration we get from Islam as lived through the example of Imam Ali, as relevant for our concern in all spheres of life, whether it be our professional life, whether it be our diet, every area of our individual and our public life, then we will be able to have an ability to influence society and those around us in a better direction. And one of the ways that we introduce Imam Ali and we introduce Islam to people is not by making them recognize that we are Muslims, but rather giving them a different perspective on what's important in life, how to live life, even if they never make the connection that this is coming from Islam or this is coming from Imam Ali, but they're one step closer to the life of Imam Ali. So sometimes when we decompartmentalize our own relationship to Imam Ali, we can do a much better job of introducing Imam Ali and Ahlul Bayt. Part of it will be explicit, and we might take his name. But a big part of it will simply be that our presence, our example might inspire somebody else to do things or think of things a little bit differently, to be a better person. And that doesn't necessarily need to have a label in order to be beneficial.
So with this, I would like to thank all of the speakers for their time, for their wisdom, for their knowledge, and for their generosity in sharing your insights, and also the organizers. This pretty much concludes this webinar, and I don't know if there's any information as to how this will be shared or will be available on YouTube or wherever else. If anyone from the organizers wants to say anything, please do, or I don't know, you have other way of announcing it. So thank you very much, and it's goodbye from here, from Davidson, small town Davidson, North Carolina. Wassalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم قل لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة ولي وحافظ وقائد وناصر حتى الليل والعين حتى تسكنه الأرض خاطوا وتمتعوا فيها طويلا. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. في أمان الله. في أمان الله everybody.
Assalamu alaikum.